So now we're going to talk about cognitive development in adolescence. So we finished the physical development part with brain changes that were happening. And now we're going to get more into detail about how those brain changes impact somebody's thinking processes. So we're going to continue talking about Piaget's, cognitive development framework, talk about egocentrism, which is different than early childhood egocentrism, look at the information processing approach and influences on adolescent cognition. Sorry. So three main theories that we're going to look at are Piaget's theory of formal operations. We're going to look at information processing theory. Remember, that's the analogy to your brains as computers. And we'll also look at sociocultural approaches. In terms of Piaget's stage theory, we are at the last stage of the 4 stages that he talked about. So sensory motor stage, infants, right? Remember, we're exploring the world and learning more through our senses. Pre-operational stage, cannot really do any kind of mental manipulations. Concrete operational stage can start doing manipulations, in their brain, but also needs manipulatives. And then formal operational stage, that's from adolescence all the way through adulthood. So in terms of egocentrism, as I mentioned, in adolescence, there's a heightened idea of self-focus. So in early childhood egocentrism, they believe that everyone is of one mind, that they think that whatever they think, everybody else thinks as well. So it's very different in adolescent egocentrism. They're concerned that anything that goes wrong, everyone notices. That's the imaginary audience, right? That's believing if you get a pimple that, oh my gosh, everyone is going to see it, and they like imagine it takes over their whole face. Or if they trip, they'll turn really, really red, like, oh my gosh, everybody saw that. Everyone thinks I'm a klutz, that kind of thing. That's the imaginary audience. So that's part of that egocentrism. The other part to egocentrism is what we call the personal fable. And that is when they believe that even if other things happen to their friends, it's not going to happen to them. So it's called a personal fable. It's almost believing that you're like your own superhero, right? Even if you're aware that car crashes are really prevalent to other adolescents, you will not believe that it's going to happen to you, that kind of idea. In terms of formal operations, the big change is that now, remember, qualitative change, abstract thought becomes a capability at starting in adolescence. And this is why in high school, right, the differences in what you're taught as opposed to elementary school, there's a big change. And that's the acknowledgement of this developmental change of abstract thought. So now people can actually think about hypothetical situations, the what if scenarios, and you can really understand and explore ideas, theoretical ideas in your brain now. And this is very new compared to other stages. So in terms of hypothetical deductive reasoning, that's being able to consider premises, right, and lead to a logical conclusion. This is that rationalization that we talk about. So for example, let's say you have these premises. Premise 1, elephants are bigger than mice. Premise 2, dogs are bigger than mice. Then you can come to the conclusion, you can deduce that elephants are bigger than dogs, right? So if elephants are bigger than mice, dogs are bigger than mice, then elephants are bigger than dogs. Argument 2, if the premise is that mice are bigger than dogs and dogs are bigger than elephants, the conclusion you would draw, even though we know it's not true, this is just a practice of logical, hypothetical, deductive reasoning. The correct conclusion is mice are bigger than elephants. So if you try to go through this with kids who are not in formal operational stage, they will not be able to follow this argument. So this is ability to do this is very rare before 6th grade. And so it's usually middle school, high school, where people can be given a set of premises and follow it to its logical conclusion, even if they know it's not actually true. Other things that increase because of formal operational stage, they can solve many more problems, a lot of problem solving. they can integrate information across different variables or dimensions. So you can have different types of information and come up with really creative solutions. And that's what's wonderful about exposing kids, starting adolescents, to different problems, because they can come up with really unique conclusions or ways to solve it. So now, they'd be introduced to the idea of justice. Politics becomes really relevant, right? 18 years old, you can start voting. So this year is a big, big year for people who just turned 18. Also, science fiction, being able to appreciate the ideas of science fiction happen as well. So with formal operational stage, people can reason about what could be potentiality and also what is, which is actuality. So philosophy, things like that, you can start to have really just good discussions with people when they're in the formal operational stage. What we notice is there's a lot of variability across cultures and individuals. So Piaget thought, because he was very Eurocentric, he thought it was a universal development, but actually it has a lot to do with exposure. So people in different cultures who are not exposed to these ideas of justice or philosophy, things like that, they're not going to be used to these the hypothetical deductive reasoning, things like that. It's not inherent. It is not something that is instinctive. It is actually something that is learned. Okay, so some things, consequences of formal operational thought. Introspection means the ability to sit down and reflect on your own thoughts and feelings. So we know a lot of teenagers like to go into their room and just think about things, and that's the introspection component. People tend to be more idealistic. So they, at this stage, are very judgmental, especially on adults in terms of how adults are behaving. So they insist on really high standards of behavior, but they may also look at other people and hold them to a different standard themselves. So that's the hypocrisy component, where they judge other people on a different standard than they would judge themselves. And then pseudo stupidity, it's not being stupid. It's called pseudo stupidity because people might overthink things. They complicate things to a point where they make a mistake in their decision making. So that's the idea of pseudo stupidity. Information processing. What we do know is, remember, for information processing, we're looking at things like memory and attention, flexibility. All of these skills actually improve. We also see that, as I mentioned before, self-regulation is not great. In terms of self-regulation, is being able to control impulses. So middle childhood, we already saw it wasn't wonderful. And in adolescence, we still have some issues with impulse control. But again, that can be improved. So that's what's really good. The deductive reasoning that we mentioned emerges. And there's something called the dual process model. So dual, there are two components. One is intuitive thought, which is kind of your snap judgments, fast, often emotional, automatic. Analytic thought is kind of the slow thinking that is deliberate, conscious, and rational. So what tends to happen is in adolescence, we tend to engage more in intuitive thought, the gut feeling, right away, first impressions. And that can get us in a lot of trouble. So it's much more advisable to slow things down, to give your analytic brain more time to consider consequences of any actions that you might take. Any questions about this one? Okay, so here are differences between inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. So if any of you ever read Sherlock Holmes, it's really funny because they always say that he did things through deduction, but actually he solved crimes through induction, not deduction. So with inductive reasoning, it's called bottom up because you start with your conclusion. You have a conclusion, you have the crime scene, right? And then you look at the crime scene, and based on observations you make about it and information you get from authority figures, and your own past experience, you come up with what happened to make this conclusion occur. So that's sort of that idea of Sherlock Holmes walking into a crime scene and looking at it, observing everything that's going on, and from past experience and knowledge of human nature, be able to recreate that, what happened to um, to develop that crime scene. Deductive reasoning, on the other hand, is called top-down reasoning because in deductive reasoning, you start with a principle. People, people are inherently good. That could be your principle. Then you apply that principle to what is going on in the situation. You might have a hypothetical case, and you're going to use logic and reasoning to extend that general principle and apply it to the situation. So if you say, okay, people are inherently good, therefore, if they're presented with the opportunity, if they see a wallet that is, doesn't have any identification but has money in it, so you'll think about the logical. The principle is people are good. They are not going to steal the money. They are going to turn it into an authority figure to find the rightful owner. So here you're taking a principle and you're using your knowledge of human nature to extend that logic and then apply it to the situation and then come up with a hypothetical case. With inductive reasoning, you have the conclusion, you have an actual situation, and you're going to use your observations and experience to kind of figure out what happened to come to that actual scene. So those are the two different ways that people do engage in reasoning. So with information processing, remember, we're focused on the executive component. How are people making decisions? What memories are they able to actually extract memories and retrieve them when they need to? Can they solve problems? All of these things actually increase in adolescence. So that's a great part to know. Some things that are debatable are the effectiveness of multitasking. As I mentioned before, in many ways, it's overrated. If you're trying to study for two different tests, going back and forth is not a good idea. It's better to focus on one and then take a break and then focus on the other rather than going back and forth. The multitasking that's effective is if the other activity does not need any kind of cognitive load on it. So throwing in your clothes in the laundry and studying while that's being done, that's a good way of multitasking. Or starting something that, a slow cook while you're studying, that's also fine. But if you need your attention on both, then that's going to be problematic. Also debatable are video games. So we know that a lot of people learn important skills through video games. So again, I think it's more about moderation. You don't want to spend all your time on video games. That could be problematic, but there are important skills that can be gained from them as well. Sociocultural approaches, really important to recognize that at this stage, interacting with peers is so important. And we learn a lot and even our intellectual development is very much influenced by our social interactions, people who, relationships that we have, and also cultural norms. So given that, in terms of cognitive framework, we talk about Piaget's formal operational stage, but it's also important to bring back Vygotsky's sociocultural theory. Remember, Vygotsky's is not a stage theory. So he believed in continuous cognitive development, whereas Piaget thought that they happened in spurts. So with Vygotsky's sociocultural theory, the idea that people that we interact with who are more learned, more experienced, or technology, all of these things can help us expand our learning. And this never stops. Whatever age you are, there will always be others or technology that can help you learn more than what you can learn by yourself. And that's really the essence of his sociocultural theory. So what you want to do is find that zone of proximal development, right? Do what you can on your own, and then recognize when you are in that zone of proximal development so you can seek help when you need it, right? That's the whole idea there. So here's a summary of the cognitive development in adolescence. right? We talked about Piaget's formal operational stage, development of abstract thought, the capability of hypothetical deductive reasoning, and critical and logical thinking. What are some things that happen because of these changes? Introspection. So adolescents tend to think a lot about their own thoughts and feelings. Idealism. They have these really high standards that in terms of how people should behave. But the hypocrisy is there where they will excuse themselves from these high standards and not excuse others. So they can be very judgy about older adults, especially. And then pseudo stupidity is that idea of overthinking, overcomplicating things, and as a result, making an erroneous decision. Also, terms you need to know, personal fable is when they believe that they're basically superheroes and whatever happens to their friends or others will not happen to them, which is super dangerous, right? That's what plays into the whole idea of risk taking. The imaginary audience is when they believe that anything negative is magnified and everyone's paying attention to all these terrible things that are happening. In terms of the information processing research, what we see is an increase in attention, increase in memory. Self-regulation is still not great in adolescence. And we see that people tend to rely on intuitive thought more than analytic thought. Makes sense because in adolescence, with all the hormonal changes and everything, there tends to be a greater reliance on that gut feeling, on intuition, rather than slowing down and thinking analytically, what is the best approach? The recommendation, though, is don't rely on your gut feeling and try to think things out. Obviously, there are situations where you're going to have to do that, but generally speaking, you have better outcomes if you do analyze situations rather than jump into them. Any questions about cognitive development?